Wait till we get the audio.
Brilliant. Hello, welcome to Derby Theatre. My name is Sarah Brigham and I'm the Artistic Director here at Derby Theatre. And I also directed The Odyssey, which is playing in our main house. In a moment I'm going to hand over to our panel, but I just wanted to really just to introduce the day with a couple of things. First of all, the reason for the symposium. You may or you may not know that Derby Theatre is a learning theatre. We are owned and run by the university, with funding from the university and also from Arts Council. And what that means is that we are unique in the UK. Not only do we produce professional theatre on our stage, but we also are very lucky to have between 100 and 150 students in our theatre every day of the week having their lectures with us, working alongside the professional team and the academic team. And really what the learning theatre means is that we start with the question, what does learning mean? Not only for our students, but also for the artists who come to work here, and also for our audience. So one of the things we do for our audience is, for instance, is we have something called talking programmes, where we train up our front of house staff, our ushers, for want of a better term, although I think the official term is customer service assistants, but we train them up to know as much as possible about the production. So they come into rehearsals, they meet the creative team, and basically they're there for our audience to ask questions and into a real dialogue. Because gone are the days when theatre is made behind closed doors and actually all you see is the end product. Now we want to engage our audience in the whole process. And today's symposium is really part of that mission, really, and that agenda. We want to talk about why we made the work. We want to bring other esteemed colleagues in to talk about the whole reinventing the classics and what that means for the sector, and have a real impact in that way. So that's really part of the reason for the symposium. And the other reason really was that it seems to be the year of the Greeks. We're doing the Odyssey, obviously. I commissioned Mike Kenny to write a fresh, engaging, new approach to the Odyssey. It's on till Saturday, so if you've not booked it, then please do. It's been very well received, thank you. Thank you to the gods. But we also commissioned Caroline Horton to make Penelope Retold alongside Lucy Dirty, who's our BBC Fellow. And that's really about, I suppose, my interest in the female voice in theatre. And actually, in these canons, quite often they are male writers, male stories, and how do we look at theatre through the female perspective? And so Caroline's written a companion piece for our studio, just 50 minutes long, looking at the story purely through Penelope's eyes. So that's 2 productions. We then also got involved in a co-production with Pilot Theatre and Marcus, which is a new version of Antigone by Roy Williams. And then fourthly, there was Manchester Royal Exchange and the Globe. We're doing a commissioned Simon Armitage to do a new production of the Iliad. I'd like to say this was all well thought out and fantastic, but actually it just came, I think, from a passion to reinvent the classics, to look at these stories that are thousands and thousands of years old. So actually, what are the resonances for us today? And I'm sure the panel will talk through that. The other reason, I suppose, for doing this symposium at this time is that, as well as running a BA Honours in Theatre Arts and Technical Theatre in the theatre, we're about to launch an MA in Writing for Performance. So this will be an opportunity, again, for the professional team to really input into an academic course of excellence alongside our academic colleagues. And just before we get on to the panel discussion, I just want to introduce you to Professor Jason Lee, who's over here. Would you mind coming this way, because we are live streaming this, which I'll explain in a moment as well. Professor Jason Lee is Head of Film and Media with Creative and Professional Writing, which includes all the MA programmes currently in the Humanities Department. And Jason's just going to talk to you a little bit about our MA. At this point, I should point out that we are live streaming, thanks to the wonder that is Pilot Theatre. So that means this is being sent out across the world, and we're not filming you, the audience. So you can sit there and do. Although there will be a point for you to ask questions, but even then you won't be on film. So don't worry. And of course, for those of you who are on Twitter, we are of course tweeting feverishly for people, and there will be questions. We're inviting the Twitter sphere and those people who can't be with us today to ask questions. We're using hashtag Reinventing Classics. that means nothing to you, don't worry. But if it does, then it's hashtag Reinventing Classics. So I'm just going to ask Jason just to talk a little bit about the MA, and then I'll get on with introducing you to the symposium. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I'll be 30 seconds. I won't swear. I usually swear all the time. This is the poster. Some of you would have got. Hopefully you've got that in front of you. It gives all the details, website address. As just been mentioned, this is a new MA starting in September, and it's in writing for performance for stage and screen. So live and recorded performance. I just mentioned a few of the modules you might be interested in. Performance writing, the art form, performance writing, the craft, producers and markets, advanced workshop practice and creative projects. So all of the teaching takes place in the theatre, so it has that professional element to it. And as a writing retreat, can be done full-time and part-time. Currently there are bursaries available. It's a unique and innovative and exciting programme, and I think Yvonne Hurt, as the programme leader for the BA, can talk to you about this in the break if you're interested, or you can send me an email or talk to me. I'm Jason Lee, that's j.lee@derby.ac.uk. Thanks a lot.
The best thing that Jason did was put a raunchy picture on the poster to get rid so on to the symposium. I'm delighted to say that Charlotte Higgins has agreed to chair today, so I'm going to hand it into her capable hands. Charlotte's the chief arts writer of The Guardian. She contributes to The Guardian's news features, literary and art sections, and is currently working on a major project about the BBC. She's author of It's All Greek to Me, How Greece Shaped Our World, and amongst a number of other publications. And I feel very privileged and really delighted to welcome Charlotte to Derby Theatre and to hand over to her to introduce everybody else.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Well, welcome to this very Greek event, because of course a symposium is a Greek event, and we should, if it's a symposium, all be having glasses of wine and lying on couches and feasting. Maybe that will come later in the tea break. Just to introduce the shape of the event, what we're going to do is hear from each of the speakers on the panel. At around 4 o'clock we're going to take a tea break, and you'll have a task in the tea break, which will be to think. And then we'll reconvene at about 4:15 for a more open discussion, which will involve you, I very much hope and trust, and we'll wrap up at about 5, depending on how we're going. But first, before we get into all of that, I would like to introduce our panellists today. Sitting on my left is Dr. Emma Griffiths, who is a lecturer at the University of Manchester in classics. She read classics at Oxford and Bristol, and she's published widely on the subject of Greek drama and mythology. And she's currently finishing work on a book to be published by OUP in 2015 about Greek tragedy called Pathos and Potential, Child Figures in Greek Tragedy. Emma's been involved in many productions of Greek drama as director, actor and consultant to student productions. Next to her is Mike Kenny, who wrote the wonderful version of the Odyssey, which is currently playing in the theatre here. He's one of England's leading theatre writers and specialising in work for families and young people. He's recipient of numerous awards, including an Olivier, and his plays are performed regularly throughout the UK and all over the world. Next to him is Caroline Horton, who is the creator of the equally wonderful Penelope Retold, which the piece of work that's happening late night after performances of the Odyssey. She's a performer, writer, dramaturg and director. She's based in Birmingham, and she trained with Philippe Gaulier in Paris after studying at Cambridge, and she's currently working on a new piece of work at the National Theatre Studio called Islands. On my right is not Roy Williams, the playwright, but Marcus Roma, the artistic director and chief executive of Pilot Theatre in York. Marcus is going to be directing the version of Antigone, Sophocles' play Antigone, that Roy is adapting for the stage. They're working together on it. Roy was to be here with us today, but alas is chasing a deadline, possibly on that very play of which we speak. And that is our panel. Marcus refused to let me say anything more about him, so, you know, but there we go. So I'm going to ask Emma to speak for a few minutes, but not before I've forgotten my bit, which was just, I suppose I was just going to sort of slightly lay out the territory. I'm a classicist as well as a writer about the arts, so this is you know, I'm so excited about hearing from our experts here. But I suppose what excites me and interests me about retellings of ancient drama and ancient story in 2014 is that the Greek myths and the myths of Homer are essentially sinuous. They are at their very heart flexible. There is no such thing as a canonical Greek myth. There are no texts. The material in the ancient world was always being retold, redefined and remade. And that's why we are still able to remake them today in our own way. That's what people have been doing for 2,000 years. And we can talk about sort of more or less faithful reversionings of Greek dramas. These are more like translations, right through to the piece of work that Caroline has made, which is, as it were, goes off into an extremely interesting and different direction and tells a whole story from a single character's point of view with a very, well, almost with a touch of Nora from Ibsen, I'd say. A feminist, I think it's best to say, a feminist retelling of that myth. Hegel, the German philosopher, talked about the study of classics in the following way. He said that there was something extraordinary about what made the ancient world so interesting and so great to study was that it stands at a great distance from us. The Greek world, as it were, is very other from our world, but we can connect to it. And there's a sort of dynamic process between the self and the other, which causes us to be able to look at ourselves more closely, paradoxically. To my mind, when things get difficult in our world and hard to talk about, we tend to go back to the Greeks, because the Greeks, in that Hegelian manner, give us a way to think about things that are tough for us to think about. And I think there's no coincidence that we have seen an upsurge of productions of Greek plays since the 2003 Iraq War. One really saw it right from the beginning at the National Theatre. Katie Mitchell directed Euripides' play Iphigenia in Aulis, which is a play about the beginning of a war. And then as we went through, one started to see productions that looked at, or plays that looked at, as it were, collateral damage in war. So Katie Mitchell also directed Trojan Women, and there was a wonderful Jonathan Kent production of Hecuba, which are about civilian damage in war. And as we are coming, let's hope, to the end of the current spate of overseas adventures, we have started to see productions of plays that deal with the aftermath of war. So recently I saw Timberlake Versenbacher's production of Sophocles' Ajax, which is about combat craziness. It's about post-combat trauma, really, in her version. And of course the Odyssey is the ultimate poem about the end of a war. What happens at the end of the war? How do you get home, literally and metaphorically? And what happens when you get there? Antigone also is a play that begins just at the very end of a war and deals with how the heck do you tidy up that terrible mess. So, on that note, let us begin. Emma, I'm going to hand over to you. So each of the speakers, we want to speak, 15 minutes. But you don't have to speak for that. You don't have to fill up that space if you don't want to.
Oh, I'm sure I can. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for everybody here at Derby Theatre. Very happy to accept the invitation to speak to you all today, and I'm certainly hoping that I'm going to learn a lot more than I'm ever able to teach here. I suppose that I was asked to contribute to this panel to give some sort of academic and historical perspective on it. And like everybody else you're going to be hearing from today, I am not in my day-to-day life involved in the creative production and reproduction of these myths, these stories. Instead, I'm on a slightly, well, not so much an outside perspective, but I'm slightly removed in that I'm more on the critical side of things, looking back at the ancient world, thinking what was going on, thinking what can we do with the little fragments, essentially, of the ancient world that have survived to us today. Because we think, oh yes, we've got Homer's Odyssey, but that was only a very small fragment of the whole range of storytelling that was happening at the time. We have Sophocles' Antigone, but compared to the number of plays that were put on in what we think of as the classical world, we have a tiny number of them. So part of what I do is to try to recreate bigger contexts, whether in the historical world or thinking about how the material that we have has been transferred to us today. And once we've done that, we start thinking about whether the same meanings attached to material, to stories, to ideas, when they were told by Homer, when they were told by Sophocles, or when they're told or retold in context today. So in one sense, I'm being asked to give you something to hang on to, some historical facts, some details about what the ancient world was like when it produced all of this material. But the difficulty is that what we think of as the historical world is a product of the imagination. We can't see it, we can't touch it. We are recreating what we think of as the ancient world every time we talk about it. And we have certain bits of information, we have fragments of plays, we have archaeological remains, we have histories telling us what happened. But as we all know, histories can be very partial. They don't always give you one clear perspective. So, although I'm going to say a few things about when the stories came into being in the way that they did, I want to just stress that all of that is very provisional, and in a sense, all of what we know about the ancient world is a product of the imagination. So, having said that, literature, as we think of it in the Western world, supposedly starts with Homer, but we don't know anything about who he was, where he was, when he was. We've got some suggestions that he was perhaps a travelling poet, stitching together lots of different stories for particular audiences, adapting to what he was asked to do at any particular point. And clearly, at some point, a remarkable individual, or individuals possibly, got together and coalesced a range of stories to give us what we now think of as the Odyssey and the Iliad, these two great epic poems. And they're not by any means the earliest long stories. If you're looking at the cultures, you've got things like the Epic of Gilgamesh that predate this. But for Western culture, the Iliad and the Odyssey is really where it all starts. But they weren't written down. This wasn't somebody sitting there and composing with a pen and paper. And when we talk about people writing on tablets, they weren't using these. They were just using little wax things that were ephemeral. So one of the key things when we look at the epic poems is to remember that they came out of a performance tradition. That the stories were being performed for audiences and with audiences. So instead of somebody giving you the story, there was always this sort of two-way process that the audience contributed, changed the focus of what was happening. And like us today, they had preoccupations that were very much the same from one audience to the other. So the Iliad is a story not just about warfare, and it has a lot of information about military tactics, but it's about fate, about love, about relationships, about what do you do when you seem to have an impossible choice. Poor Achilles, as many of you will know in that story, is originally given the idea he can choose to have a nice, quiet, safe, long life at home, but nobody will ever know who he is. Or he can have this dramatic, glorious life, but die young in battle. So the Iliad gets a lot of attention. There's a lot of storm and noise there. But in many ways, the Odyssey, the sort of companion piece, which tells of Odysseus' return home after the war, in many ways that story tells us more about the nature of war than the Iliad could. Firstly, because in the Odyssey, we see Achilles again, but this time he's dead. And this time, he says he made the wrong choice. He says he shouldn't have chosen to have the short life of glory. He should have been the poorest peasant but been alive. So that's one reason why you can sort of understand the Iliad if you look at the Odyssey. You only need to do one and you get two. The other thing is that the Odyssey is a powerful story, not just about war, but about what it is to be human. Because many of you will know from the Odyssey, there are lots of monsters, there are gods coming down, there are peculiar things happening. But throughout it all, the hero, Odysseus, is resolutely human. He actually turns down the offers of immortality that are made to him. So he really is somebody that we can identify with. And in the course of the story, his journeys home, we learn that he deals with so many situations that we face in one form or another today. So the Odyssey as a story focusing around Odysseus is obviously going to be something we can look at today and see, of course, that's relevant. But it's also got the other stories with it. You buy one story and you get 4 or 5 others free, including what's been happening at home. How has Penelope, Odysseus' wife, been coping? How has her son grown up without his father figure? And the interweaving of all these different elements, the different stories, the different families, is what makes it so powerful. Now, I said that these things were produced from a performance culture. So that's why today having theatrical productions of these stories would have been perfectly understandable to the Greeks. Because we tend to think of Homer as somebody who stood up and told stories. But if you look at the bits of evidence we've got, say from the philosopher Plato, when he talks about the rhapsode who sings Homer, he talks about him jumping up, grabbing people out of the audience, really getting into character. So, although we think about epic poetry as something sort of written and that you today can read, for the ancient audience it was a performance just as much as the Greek tragedies, which we're a little bit more familiar with as being theatrical, they're theatrical productions as well. So I just want to say 1 or 2 more specific details to try and contextualize some of this. One is that the ancient world, despite all of the good things that came out of it, the democracy, the love of arts and so on, it was constantly at war. There was constant conflict between small states, between nations, between individuals. If you look at all the letters that we have surviving from later periods, it's all about conflicts. People writing to the council, wanting problems with their taxes sorted out. So there's a lot that we can understand in terms of shared experiences and shared emotions without having to work terribly hard at all. Warfare is always there in the background. Even at times of peace, there is fighting somewhere else. So in the same way that we sitting here today are in a very quiet, privileged position, and yes, in many ways our troops are starting to come home, we can't be unaware of what's going on in Ukraine, for example. And I think there was the same sort of dynamic happening with all of these ancient stories. So we don't know much about Homer at all, but we have his work, so we can very often see something of the man there. In the case of Sophocles, however, who's the writer who produced the play Antigone, which you haven't had a chance to see yet, but we hope to whet your appetite for, we do know a bit about him. And although I could tell you all sorts of interesting facts about him and his views and what he wrote about, the most interesting thing today is that a couple of years after he wrote this play Antigone, another play about conflict and the aftermath of war, Sophocles was actually appointed as general in Athens. So he was somebody who got his hands dirty. He wasn't somebody on the sidelines just commenting. He was actually engaged with day-to-day life, and he was writing plays using stories from the mythological past, but in order to talk to his own people at the time. And those stories were from the distant past, even when the original audiences of Antigone or Homer heard them. So I think that our playwrights and our producers today are being a little modest when they're calling their works Penelope retold, because essentially these creative forces today are doing exactly the same thing as Homer, as Sophocles were doing in the ancient world. They were taking these stories, telling them in a way that made them relevant to their original audiences. So I hope very much that we're going to learn more today about the creative processes and how this has worked. But I think the most important thing is for us, for you, to simply experience the immediate production, to think about this story as a new story now. You know about the past, you might know all the historical details, but the most important thing is that you bring yourself. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was incredibly inspiring. And I'd like us now to turn to Mike, who has worked on the Odyssey. And I suppose what really fascinates me, Mike, is that the Odyssey is such a non-linear poem. It's a poem of twists and turns, it's labyrinthine, it jumps all over the place. It doesn't tell the story from A to Z, it goes all over the place. It's got monsters, witches, special effects beyond even possibly the ingenuity of Sarah, who directed the show. So how did you set about attempting to solve all these problems and make a coherent two-act play?
It's one of those. I mean, of course, I said yes immediately and then thought about it the way you do with these things. And of course, it's impossible. It's an absolutely impossible task. It's like, which I said last night, it's like getting a gallon into a shot glass. But I think it may be even more extreme than that. Antigone is at least a play. But this is a kind of an epic poem. And I read somebody saying it was probably the first model for a novel, and if you stood up and sung it as it was done originally without a break, it would take about 30 hours to do. So it's sort of the Breaking Bad of its day. Really. I mean, it's clearly meant to be probably told over a winter, or and it's episodic, so it feels like a serial. And I turned it into a 2-hour play. So if you imagine a whole of the 5 series of Breaking Bad turned into a play, that's the task. And its inevitable difficulty means that every time somebody... I've written a lot of plays, and I'm not one of those playwrights who doesn't read reviews. I read them. I'm really interested in what people have got to say. But actually, every single review tells you in what way you failed. Like, you've missed out all the best bits. The language that you've used isn't big enough, etc. Actually, what Emma just said was extremely reassuring to me, because I think absolutely they are stories that we remake for the present. And I was asked when I talked today to kind of address its contemporary relevance. So that's kind of what I'm going to try and look at, given that I couldn't do all of it, In the most obvious thing I took consciously from Greek theatre was the notion of a chorus. I suppose because I work a lot with families and children, I resist the fourth wall as a concept almost obsessively. I like the play to be addressing the audience in real time, for us to know that we're both in the same room, I hate audiences that are kind of turned into voyeurs, allowed to watch this thing that is happening on the stage, as opposed to addressed directly. And that's the beginning of the Odyssey kind of calls from a muse and is straight in addressing the audience. You can tell this is performed. So I adopted that, although we have a cast of 8, which nowadays is a very big cast, and actually I just lost count in the end. I kind of went, yeah, no, another one, you know. In the end, Sarah worked it all out. Bless her heart, because I think I was using numbers in the end. I was struck as well when I read it, that the thing that I thought was the Odyssey, which was the big journey and the Cyclops and the Siren and all of that, is actually 4 of the 24 books. It's actually a very small part of it. And it might have been kind of appropriated from the previous Jason and the Argonauts myth, and that's the bit that contains all the monsters. And I began to think maybe it's not even true. Maybe it's old soldiers' stories. The bulk of it is absolutely about the recovery from the war, and is set in and around the home to which Odysseus is attempting to return. So I kind of split my play down the middle. The first half is like the men's story, and the second half is the women's story, sort of. And as a result, they're very, very different. The first half is full of fights and adventures and monsters and sirens, and the second half hardly changes location. It's set in a single location. It's yeah. Do you know, I never worried. It is so contemporary in its telling that while doing it, I never really worried about its contemporary relevance. It seems obviously, you know, like wars and the effects of wars are with us and are likely to remain with us for a very long time, I think. And it's very perceptive as to how it deals with that. Odysseus sets off from Troy with 600 men, and by the time he arrives home, they're all dead. He's alone when he walks back into his home. But I think that could be said of soldiers now when they return. They make that particular journey, they cross that threshold on their own, you know? There's another thing I discovered in it, which I think is incredibly relevant now, and it surprised me. I learned a new word. You know, there are words in some languages that don't have words in other languages, you know, like Schadenfreude. And like, when I was working on a retelling of Red Riding Hood, I discovered the word Waldeinsamkeit in German, which is the feeling of being alone in a forest, which we don't have a word for, you know. And there's a Greek word called xenia, which is Xenia. I actually have a friend who runs a children's theatre in Athens called Xenia Kalogeropoulou. And I've known her for a very long time. She's an amazing woman, but I never knew that her name meant anything. And what it actually means is the obligation to take care and welcome strangers. The Odyssey is absolutely full of this. The journey that Odysseus makes in the first half of my play, he's constantly in a position where he's a stranger, and people react to him in very different ways. The second half of my play, he comes home and his house is full of strangers who are abusing that deep, I mean, it's obviously, if it's got a word for it, it's a deep cultural phenomenon, yeah? And I didn't realise until I got to the end of the play, really, that I'd written this in. Characters over and over again say Zeus places this obligation on us to welcome the stranger. I think it's fascinating in the world we're in now. Actually, even this morning, I watched on the TV a thing about Romanians, you know, coming here, taking our jobs, whatever. There's an implicit discussion that obviously, with people moving around the Mediterranean, was there in Homer's time. and and in Greece at the moment, interestingly, is a huge issue, you know. Because I suppose because of a lot of people there see themselves as the front line of the movement from the East. There's a kind of an explosion of racism, etc. So it is full. This stuff is full of the riches of contemporary resonance. You don't have to go far to look for it. I think I'm going to stop then, actually, and pass the baton on, because obviously I could talk at some length about
like it.
like I just did, yes.
Thank you so much, Mike. Caroline, we want to turn to next, and I was thinking about Penelope Retold, particularly when Emma was talking earlier about the story, a little story about Achilles in the Odyssey, when Odysseus finds Achilles in the underworld. And Achilles gives us that sense of an alternative life that he might have had. My sense is that the Odyssey often contains alternatives of itself within it. It's such a twisty-turny poem. It offers you all, you know, the paths fork. Odysseus tells lies. It contains lots of inverses of itself within it. And, you know, lots of writers have noticed, later writers have noticed and fallen in love with this quality. There's a wonderful novel called The Lost Books of the Odyssey by Zachary Mason, which was published 2 or 3 years ago, which imagines all kinds of alternative Odysseys, all kinds of alternative fates for Odysseus and Penelope and the other characters in the book. And I think Caroline's work has a little bit of this in it. There's a sense that there's a whole other poem that it would be possible to tell that was Penelope's poem. I'm just going to leave that open and hand the baton to you, Caroline.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I suppose just to talk a little bit about how this piece came into being. Sarah had seen a couple of plays that I'd made. So I'm a theatre maker. I tend to improvise, then write, then perform my own work. Sometimes with a company. I've done quite a lot of solo work as well. And so Sarah approached me with a really unusual thing. Like, so as I often get asked by another company or another theatre to come in as an actor or a director, but I think this is the first time they've said, well, go make it. And that was really exciting. So a bit like Mike, I just said yes. I didn't look at the time frame. I didn't look at, because it was really exciting, and it's been brilliant. And I've worked with the wonderful Lucy Doherty of Milk Presents over there, who's worked on it really closely with me as a director. And so I spent a bit of time getting together some ideas. I also reread the Odyssey because I'd read it several times over the years. My first encounter with it was actually a quite batty headmaster of mine when I was about 10. Didn't really bother teaching us. I think it was meant to be history and Latin he was meant to be teaching us, but instead he just told us episodes from the Odyssey, marched up and down doing all the voices, and we were just like, oh my god, it's amazing. So I'd sort of fallen in love with it really young, and then I studied English Lit at university and kind of rediscovered it then alongside all the Greek tragedies. So I had it in that part of my brain as well. But when I reread it this time, because of this remit to tell Penelope's story in some way, Sarah was also incredibly open with the brief. She said, just make something. Penelope, but make something. So it's like, okay. And I was completely gobsmacked when I got to the end of it. And I was like, I'd completely forgotten that he comes back after 19 years and then immediately leaves. And this was just, I couldn't believe I'd forgotten that happened. And so I think from the moment I reread that, I was like, right, that's when we start, I think. And then it was great reading Mike's version of the Odyssey, which finishes just as he's come back, or just they've been reunited. So Penelope's sort of, my little piece begins just at that point. What else was I going to say? I've completely gone off on a tangent. I wrote notes and everything.
I'm just going to, while you collect your thoughts, that I think we all forget this thing at the end of the Odyssey, because there's the obvious fairy tale ending, that he comes home and they're reunited, but actually this very peculiar thing happens, which is he has to go off on another quest to find a people who have never seen an oar before and mistake it for a threshing tool. Is that right, Emma? And it's a very, very, very odd thing. But yeah.
Yeah. So this was sort of my point of departure, I suppose, from in Homer's text, and then I also started getting fascinated, partly because of the angle that Sarah and Mike were taking on the piece, in terms of the sort of contemporary military experience. What is it actually for any soldier then or now to come back from war? But again, having been given the Penelope side of things, what was it like for the women at home, or the partner at home? Penelope happens to be a woman, so forgive me if I refer to wife. But so I started reading about that, and also got quite obsessed by a YouTube channel, which is called Military Spouse Tag. And it's these series of questions that military wives, they sort of, and it's sort of a way for them to share their experiences with one another, but they kind of pass these questions to one another and go through answering them, and they're extraordinary. The drama and the different levels you see as you watch these women kind of saying how supportive they are of what their husbands are doing, and how important the military is, and their obvious pain at the separation. I was completely fascinated. Also, these videos again on YouTube about homecomings. There are these montages, often put to incredibly emotional soundtracks, about soldiers and their partners being reunited, or often the man and his children. And again, this kind of dramatic music is saying, isn't this wonderful and happy? And often all the people standing around watching or videoing have these massive grins and, oh, isn't it wonderful? And just the pain of the actual individuals involved in that reunion was, quite... Lucy and I spent one Saturday morning sort of traumatizing ourselves, watching them sort of endlessly on YouTube. But there's so much going on there, and so I got really hooked by that. And this wonderful book called Vietnam Wives by, I wrote down her name, Aphrodite Matsakis. I will have totally mispronounced that. But again, about the experience of the women dealing with these soldiers, these veterans of the Vietnam War, and what their experience was like. And there's this wonderful chapter in it called Stay or Go. And for me, that was where I was starting to discover that I wanted to put Penelope in this constant state of stuck. I've set my piece in their bed, which crops up a lot in the Odyssey. This bed that Odysseus has carved out of an olive tree, whose roots are still in the ground, like this immovable sort of symbol of them and their marriage. And so I set it there and set Penelope in this dilemma and this cycle of emotions that go from hate to pain to missing him and conjuring him for herself, and she goes through all of that and a real sense of rebellion. So she kind of goes through all of that, and she's stuck. So that's where I decided to put my show. And just to finish off, like the other thing I got really, really curious about and found a lot of in in her little reactions to things in Homer's work, but also in my connection to her, is this sense of a rebellion or a protest. Some friends of mine were really heavily involved in all the uprisings and so on, the protest, that movement in Cairo, in Egypt. So I talked to them a lot about what was going on in sort of the aftermath of Tahrir Square. And they were involved in, I don't know if you come across it, it started off in Turkey, but that pot banging rebellion. So a curfew was enforced. And because they didn't want to be silenced, but they were kind of stuck, people began at curfew to bang pots in their homes as a protest, kind of as saying, well, we don't fit with either of these alternatives we're being offered, but we don't want to remain silent. So I was interested in looking for ways in which, how does Penelope, who is stuck, how does she protest from her sort of domestic bedroom sphere? What does she have? So we use song. She rips up bed at some point. She battles with whether she can go out. At points as well, she describes experiences where I just bung the whole thing right into the 21st century, and she goes on a massive night clubbing and flirts outrageously with all of Odysseus's friends. But that's in there because of this sense of like a need to do something. And in a little way, I talked to Lucy quite a bit about this, but my husband was not away 19 years, but he was away for 3 months. And he chose to go and study abroad. And I was very supportive. Very! So supportive! And gradually, while he was away, I just started to behave like, I don't know. I moved, I changed the house around. I bought quite a lot of new clothes so that when I saw him, didn't, who's that? Feeling. But anything, like, I didn't answer the phone. I was unavailable, I was really busy, I was having a great time. But all of this, and like speaking to some people we were lucky enough to be connected with, like wonderful Daisy, she's not here today, but a wonderful local actress who'd had an experience of being a military spouse, was so frank and open with us, and was a huge influence on the piece I ended up making. But that sense of rebellion and rage became really fundamental in what I wanted to make from Penelope's story. Thank you.
Well, it is very angry. It's very angry. It's magnificent. It's magnificently angry. You really get the sense of how pissed off this woman would be. You've been away for 19 years and then he goes away again. Not good. So finally, I'd like us to turn to Antigone. And just to contact, I just realised that we haven't said any dates, and in a very head girl kind of way, I think Emma will correct me, but Homer was probably consigned to, written down from an earlier oral tradition, do we say about 700, or do you, this is very tricky territory?
That's generally accepted. You will find some scholars who are arguing bitterly that it was a different century and that you must never say it was this, but yes, most people are still thinking.
For the sake of argument, so about roughly 700. And we scoot on several centuries to Sophocles' Antigone, which is probably about 441. So, you know, slap bang in the sort of golden age of Athens' great sort of cultural flowering, but as Emma has pointed out, you know, that golden age of flowering when Socrates was walking the streets of Athens was also an age of almost uninterrupted violence, and in the case of Athens, pretty vicious empire building and some extremely nasty, you know, kind of slaughtering the inhabitants of small islands in order to bring those places into the sort of Athenian empire. So all that is going on, and as Emma pointed out, I mean, I think one of the striking things about Athens in the 5th century is that every citizen male would have been a combatant, really. Do you think that's fair enough to say?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, all of Aeschylus's brother died in the Persian Wars. Sophocles was a general, and Euripides, I don't know, can't remember.
Euripides' mother was a greengrocer.
Great!
And,
peaceful.
and he wasn't involved explicitly in this, but he was very much
He certainly
rebel.
wrote. He certainly
Yeah.
wrote very vividly about the impact of war.
Yeah.
Antigone begins just as Thebes, the city of Thebes, has been more or less torn apart by a war between her two brothers. Marcus, can I hand you the baton?
Thank you, Sean. Thank you. It's great to be here. And Roy does send his apologies. He's actually got a work clash. I mean, he was desperate to be here. And so I've come from the subs bench, and I'm delighted to be here as director of Pilot Theatre. I've worked with Roy for 25 years, and we've known each other way back. And one of the really interesting things is kind of contextualise what our Antigone's going to look like. And there's some things, and there's some of our brochures around that. And for those of you who don't know Roy's work, it comes from the same sort of DNA, both of us as theatre makers. We started out making theatre in schools and youth clubs, which honestly are probably some of the toughest gigs known to man and womankind. Basically, I still make work of, and I have in the front row in my mind, the people I call the reluctant dragged-alongs. And they're the people who are there going, I've got to go to this bloody play, and I'm hard to hit, it's got to be good for me, and I've got to make an essay about it. And I have that in my mind because actually we still get that. And my point about making work is trying to find those relevant points that are going to make those people feel there is absolutely something extraordinary in this that I really want to take away. It was something I was not going to expect to see. And so all the work we've made over the time has been based around that, and the work we do at Pilot is based around that. And both Roy and I come from that world of having made work in those very different, almost like they're combative arenas. If you take work into, they really are like you're going into that. So that's what we do, and we've been making work like that, as I say, for a number of years. And in fact, it's interesting that Mike mentioned Breaking Bad, because where the conversation with Roy and I started was on the press night of the last show that Roy wrote for us, which was The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner. It was an adaptation of the Silico novel, which we did 18 months ago. And we said, I said, Roy, look, this has gone really well. What do you want? What have you always wanted to do? And he goes, I always get asked to write things that are pretty blokey. There's lots of sort of male kind of work that he does, and so he's always wanted to adapt Antigone with a really central, strong female protagonist, which for us was absolutely, brilliant and key, because all the work we do looks at that moment of the transition between young people and their parents, young people and their peers, young people and their pressures, and that places it right at the heart for us in terms of wanting to make a piece of work. And we started talking about The Wire and Breaking Bad and House of Cards, and these are the modern epics of our time. These are things that, Mike, we hadn't spoken about this before actually, but those things around those box sets, how many people here are familiar with the kind of the long durational series, you kind of get absorbed, they become absorbing. And I think that all this kind of work was that of its time. And it's interesting, I think that the way that the Odyssey ends is because I think Homer's going, I'm going for a second series on this. I'm going to get recommissioned on this. This has gone really well.
Actually, one of the things about the Odyssey that I didn't mention is that it's a sequel. It's already a sequel.
He was on to season 3. So the idea of those things being continuing dramas is possible. And it's what you said at the beginning, that these were made to be played and shared and performed and delivered and made relevant and made potent and made to have those connections with our audiences. Because that's what we do when we make theatre and we make work. Yes, of course we read and analyse them, but of course they're meant to be taken and shared and delivered and adapted and the corners knocked off them and not to be holy about them. And I think so the idea about making work which really does have an authenticity, a relevance for now and where we find ourselves and what it has to do with connecting with making really, really good stories. Because at the end of the day, it's interesting why we say that only a few of these, the good ones have survived, because there are plenty out there that probably weren't quite so good. They're the ones on the different channels, but these are the ones that survive because they're really great stories. And they're great stories because they're dealing with archetypal problems and things which haven't gone away through generations and cultures. And they are perennial in the way that people are dealing with their parents, with their relationships, with their nascent relationships, and also with their struggles with different sides and factions. which is why they're enduring and why they've lasted and stood the test of time, which is why we're always drawn back to them. I'm really fascinated by what we're going to be doing with this. So as I say, we've got draft 2. I'm waiting. Draft 3 is on its way, and it's extraordinarily exciting to be working with Roy on this, because the way that we've taken some liberties. She's called Tig. Her sister's called Esme. And we started to play around with what we might feel who these people are. And the other thing we're going to do is we're going to do it in real time. It's going to take place in real time. It's outside a club. It's in between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Okay, it's happening in a real time period for us in the audience. And we want to be able to set that in this space of this club, where the chorus can be the people who are the door guards, the people with the monitors, the in-ear, the actual ones that have got the cameras, security. Who's looking down on who? Creon is Creo in ours, and Tiresias is Tyrone, and we've got this kind of nature of hierarchy of people slipping and losing the grasp of power, and seeing other people coming up underneath and trying desperately to hang on, which is what we can see all the way through in terms of structures of society in our spaces and places that we examine and work today. And we know those struggles between intergenerations and people trying to grasp on and knowing what that can be. So,
will you just tell us the story of Antigone quickly? Yes. I just think, just because a lot of us will have seen the Odyssey. Of course. And we might not have seen Antigone.
Okay, of course. That's me making some massive assumptions, so I do apologise. One of those, Antigone is, her brother's just been killed. Her brother's just been killed. And he is lying out there in the road, and she wants to bury him. Creon, who is the father of her boyfriend, forbids him to do that. They're warring factions, and what happens is that there's a whole fight for her rights to be able to want to give the burial to her brother that he deserves, and he's lying out there. And she's not allowed to do that. She's kept away, she's pushed away, and so she stands up with her sister to fight for that, to be able to go and do that. And what she does is she does go do that, and she gets captured, she gets trapped, she gets thrown away, she gets buried alive. There's a whole series of things that she endures to stand up for her principle about what she wants to do. What she wants to do. Of course, at the end, what happens is, the spoiler alert here is going to come out, but I'm going to go with that. I'm not going to say. What happens is, of course, that she dies, her boyfriend dies, who is the son of Creon. Creon is told this is going to happen and bad things will happen, and his wife then kills herself. So basically, it all rains down on him because he shouldn't have done the bad shit. But what happens is that this is the whole thing around what's going to come to pass, and it's about somebody trying to do the right thing, but as Creon, but also thinking this is holding on to the principle, but actually things are going to start falling apart. But she is such an incredibly strong and brilliant character around the way that she wants to fight for that principle. She absolutely wants to do that for her brother, and she's not going to take any rubbish from people that she doesn't respect, and she doesn't see that the way forward. So she absolutely does fight for that, and she will stand up for that. So really, that's where we are with the kind of the global narrative. But what we're doing with that is we're taking that and making that and placing it for now, in a space and a place between people who are rivals, who have different kind of power networks and controls, who absolutely are in a way of distorting that. And she's actually standing up for that as herself in this particular environment where we're setting it. So as again, all of this stuff is slightly moving because I'm waiting for draft 3, but it is actually based on Antigone, and it is the story, but it is the state of the way that this young girl, this young woman, absolutely will be prepared to die for her belief and her passion.
Now it is a play. It's a play about. It's always clearly been a play about power. I mean, in the numberless readings of this play, it's hard to get away from that. It's Antigone versus Creon, the young woman versus the man with the official power. But I guess what really shines through Sophocles, which is perhaps not a thing for now, is that he's got law on his side, but she's got the gods on her side. And the gods we'll perhaps come back to this after the break, but the gods are tricky perhaps now for us because we don't live in a polytheistic universe, or indeed one where you know, there's going to be an immediate interaction between us and divine power going to blast us to the ground. So how do you negotiate? How are you negotiating the gods?
Well, as I say, in the same way that Mike was really, in terms of saying that what we have to say is that where this relevance is now, we've got lots of things, because the way that we work is why we're live streaming this today. There's going to be lots of different cameras and viewpoints, and we're going to be playing around with some of the form in this, around who's watching who and where the viewpoints looking down on that world are from. So we're going to be able to play with that in terms of relaying some vision and points of view within that, which is again, you know, part of the nature of the location and the physical space we're going to be taking it. But using those ideas of unseen eyes or people looking down, and again using the sense of the way that the chorus works, which are the guards, the overseers, the bouncers, the ones who are blocking the people out, who are stopping people getting forward, who actually are seeing things, but they've also got things in their ears and they're getting other messages through from Crayon and the kind of hierarchical structure. So the idea of us being able to create a world which allows those things to happen, that does allow us to have a kind of a choral voice between the guards and the bouncers. It really does allow us to be able to play with that. And as I say, using the technology, and we're going to be doing some quite interesting things, we think, is about different points of view. So for example, we're going to fit some cameras into the space that aren't seen by the audience. So it's possible when you're watching the play, you know, Antigone might have that back to you, and she's railing at something. Where she's standing on stage is exactly the same point where you can see directly down the camera lens. She's absolutely on a close-up. You can see it another point of view. So you can view the play from another perspective at another time later on in terms of how you want to revisit it. So the opportunity of being able to see that from a number of different perspectives and different points of view from within the character's space and place within the world is something we want to explore theatrically.
Wonderful. Well, I think we should pause there for a little bit. I was thinking about your box set point and remembering that David Simon, who wrote The Wire, does it the other way around. He uses the Greeks. He's hugely inspired by Greek tragedy, and in season 2, when he has a character called the Greek, that is because he's thinking about Aeschylus. So these, you know, what comes around goes around in a very satisfying way in that sense. But I think we should break for 10 minutes. What time is it now?
15, 20.
Okay, so
15. I say 15.
Reconvene at 5 to 4. Please don't go away. Please come back, and because it's your turn to speak and engage in this conversation. Cups of tea over there. And coffee. And see you in 15 minutes.